All right, let's dive right into today's explainer. We're unpacking a really fascinating source text today, one that completely reimagines the Genesis creation narrative as we usually hear it. We're going to embark on this epic exploration of the fifth day of creation. We'll be looking specifically at the foundational waters of the earth and the absolutely fearsome, magnificent creatures said to be living in those unimaginable depths. This perspective blends ancient theology, literal biological engineering, and honestly, a pretty profound critique of modern historical timelines. It's a really wild ride, so let's just jump right in. So, take a look at this quote from the book of Job. It immediately begs a question that sounds like it belongs straight in a fantasy novel, right? Did literal, awe-inspiring, fire-breathing dragons actually rule a perfect, peaceful Earth? Well, the source text we're examining today gives a resounding yes. It actually posits that creatures like the Leviathan weren't just these poetic metaphors for chaos. They weren't exaggerated accounts of angry crocodiles. No, they were literal, magnificent, fire-producing sea dragons created by deliberate divine design. But to really wrap our heads around these creatures, the source says we first kind of need to toss out our modern view of the cosmos. The text outlines a biblical architecture that is a strict, intentional departure from the spherical globe model. Instead, it describes the ancient Earth as this vast plain that was founded literally upon the seas, established right on top of the floods, and covered by this massive tent-like structure called the firmament. So in this view, the waters weren't just, a surface feature resting on the dirt. They were the very foundation of this entirely perfectly ordered architecture. Which brings us to the actual events of the fifth day. The source puts a huge spotlight on the ancient Hebrew word sheretz. When those foundational waters were commanded to bring forth life, they didn't just passively produce a few nice schools of fish. Sheretz literally translates to a teeming, swarming multitude. The text describes this as a violently glorious eruption of biological life. It's like the foundational waters just exploded with an incomprehensible variety and volume of creatures. And this is long before dry land animals even existed. So from that sudden, violent explosion of life, the world's architecture fills up incredibly fast. The open firmament, that massive tent-like sky we talked about, was instantly filled with every winged fowl in their courses. And at the exact same time, the deepest foundational waters were populated with the true apex creatures of the fifth day. But here's where the source text points out a crucial and honestly fascinating translation issue with how we usually read this passage today. You see, the Hebrew word used here is taninim. Now, modern translations often soften that word. They'll say it means whales or maybe large fish. But the source text is adamant that this is a mistranslation, one that completely strips away the true scale and majesty of what was actually created in those waters. Taninim actually refers to great sea dragons. We're talking magnificent serpentine creatures of just enormous power, scale, and terror. So the ancient waters weren't just filled with standard marine life. The text argues they were filled with literal, actual dragons. And the absolute, undisputed king of these creatures, the Leviathan. Now, the source text does not treat Leviathan's fire-breathing capability as some kind of ancient mystical magic. It treats it as literal, hyper-advanced biological engineering. It even points to real-world biology like the bombardier beetle. I mean, think about how crazy that is. Nature already has a blueprint for this stuff. The bombardier beetle has these separated internal chambers that mix chemicals together to violently spray boiling liquid. According to the text, the Leviathan featured a massively scaled-up version of that exact system in its neck. When it raised its head out of the water, a nasal smoke mechanism engaged, followed by highly volatile chemical combustion right at the mouth. And if you're wondering how a sea creature kept its internal fires from drowning, the text explains it had a highly advanced sealed scale architecture. The scales were shut so tight that no air, and more importantly, no freezing seawater, could ever get in. Okay, so this brings up a pretty massive mystery. If this original creation was completely perfect, totally harmonious, and had absolutely zero death or predation going on, why did the Leviathan need a highly engineered, deadly fire-breathing weapon from day one? I mean, biological defense implies there's a threat, right? So what in the world was threatening a massive armored sea dragon in a perfect paradise? To answer that, the source dives into some profound ancient spiritual context. Drawing from heavy theological texts like the Book of Enoch, the document outlines this massive pre-Eden conflict. It argues that before Adam even took a single step in the garden, there had already been a devastating war in heaven, and the great adversary was cast down into the deep. Because of that, the earth was already a heavily contested war zone. The fallen host, those ancient watchers, were actively trying to biologically and physically corrupt the new creation. So Leviathan's impenetrable armor and roaring fire, the text says those were marks of divine protection. It was a creature set apart in the deep, built to be completely immune to the corruption of those fallen entities. And this perfectly sets up the next major philosophical shift in the text. In that original perfect world, Leviathan's fire wasn't primarily a defensive weapon against predators. It was doxological. Now, that's a theological term, but basically it means it was an instrument meant for joy, for play, and for declaring divine power. Just imagine the absolute awe of this for a second. A massive serpentine creature breaching the surface of the uncorrupted deep, breathing roaring fire and smoke into the sky, not because it was angry, not because it was scared, but as a pure, magnificent, joyful declaration of the overwhelming glory of the one who created it. In this beautiful, pre-fall world, mankind's relationship with these massive beasts was completely different too. The text highlights the ancient Hebrew concept of radah, which translates to dominion. But it's really important to note, this wasn't the dominion of some cruel tyrant. It was royal stewardship. It was the role of a good, just king who tends, guards, and actually cares for his subjects. Man and dragon literally coexisted in a state of deep wonder and sacred responsibility. There was none of that violent predator and prey dynamic that we're so used to today. But of course, as we know, that harmony shattered. The text heavily contrasts this original creation with the fallen world we live in right now. Originally, you had perfect peace. All beasts, even the great terrifying dragons, ate green herbs for food. Fire was just for glory and play. But after the fall, that entire system fractured. Deep-seated fear entered the dynamic between mankind and animals. The world shifted into a violent predator and prey reality. And Leviathan's doxological fire, it was suddenly forced to become a defensive weapon, just for sheer survival. The perfect harmony was broken. Now, this source text takes a pretty sharp pivot here to talk about how modern humanity perceives these ancient creatures today. It actually argues that modern paleontology and the broader scientific establishment are engaged in a massive, coordinated deception. According to the document, the establishment deliberately suppresses the biblical timeline, the one that claims a literal six-day creation where humans and beasts coexisted. And why would they do that? Well, the text claims it's to construct a strictly materialist narrative, one based entirely on deep time, random evolution, and a total disconnect from that original divine architecture we've been talking about. So the text synthesizes this critique of modern museums into three specific levels of alleged deception. First up, it claims that the dinosaur reconstructions you see in museums are presented to the public with a lot of false certainty, when in reality, they're mostly built on heavily fragmented bones padded out with plaster and guesswork. Second, it alleges a deliberate, documented suppression of giant human remains, specifically the Nephilim, those ancient giants mentioned in Genesis, because proving their existence would prove that humans and giant beasts lived at the same time. And third, it argues that museums purposefully disconnect massive fossil discoveries from the ancient worldwide historical accounts of dragons, rebranding them just as evolutionary anomalies so they fit nicely into a materialist timeline. Yet even with all of this, despite living in a broken world and despite the historical narratives that the text argues are suppressing the truth, the source concludes this epic journey by looking forward with just immense hope. It points to a promised future restoration. Using this incredibly beautiful quote from Isaiah, the text asserts that the original doxological harmony of the fifth day is actually going to return. Someday, the fear between mankind and the magnificent creatures of the earth will finally be removed, and that sacred, joyful, royal stewardship is going to be restored perfectly. And that leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative thought. The text notes that the book of Revelation explicitly states that in the final days there will be no more sea. Well, if the great foundational deep is currently a holding place for these magnificent ancient Taninim, what exactly is waiting down there? When the sea finally passes away, what unsearchable, reserved mysteries of creation are going to be revealed to the world? It really completely changes how you look at the ocean, doesn't it? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep questioning the incredible architecture of the world around you.